More Than a Dream, a Good Omens fanfiction, written by Sodium Azide, read aloud by SkyAsimaru. If you enjoy this podfic, you can check out the original story on Archive of Our Own. If you would like to hear more of my recordings or see some of my own work, you can find me through the pen and screen name of SkyAsimaru. More Than a Dream. Summary. Exhausted single mom Crowley just needs to get internet access for a while, just until her new place gets set up. Just please sleep for a while and don't scream your head off, sweetie. When her baby does what babies do, the head librarian comes out to investigate the trouble. He is every stereotype wrapped up with a bow tie on top, which enthralls little Warlock. That's how everything begins. Who knew how delicious a man in a worn waistcoat would look, holding a baby and rocking him to sleep? She is going to peel off those sleeve garters with her teeth. A light and fluffy human AU meet ugly. Whatever else was true about this new place, all libraries were the same. As long as the building was open, it would be free. There would be books and, crucially, open access computers. Only a few more days until the end of the month, and Crowley had already raised hell with the internet installation support bastards, who swore on all they held dear that there would be a technician out tomorrow. Sometime between dawn and midnight, it seemed, and they weren't willing to narrow down the time window further. To install access at the new digs. She was getting extremely close to running out of data on her phone, so Wi-Fi was a necessity. Before, Crowley would have hit up a Starbucks for a leisurely few hours, but that was no longer a feasible option. Lifestyle change was the most euphemistic way to put it, if significantly inadequate for the actual cause. And although it was a bugger, she didn't regret it. Anyway, as long as she got everything set up and these last address changes confirmed before the 30th, then she could head back to their new home and to her hip and stylish lifestyle of sink baths and cardboard boxes and so much laundry. How was there so much laundry? Holy fuck! Okay, so all she needed was maybe half an hour, tops. Crowley had barely remembered to bring a wrinkled copy of her lease. So, after verifying the address, the bored woman at the front desk was able to get her set up with a library card. And in only a few minutes, Crowley was sitting down at one of the only empty terminals. Thank the fates that it was on the end of the row, because she took up a lot more room than she used to. Well, not quite her, but the baby took up a huge amount of space. Little Warlock, personally, was about the same size and weight as a bag of flour, but his carrier was wide and ungainly, and that wasn't even counting the assorted bags that were required for them to leave the house and exist out in the world. Babies needed so much stuff. Crowley held her breath as she settled Warlock's carrier on the floor by her chair. But aside from a twitch of a tiny socked foot, he stayed asleep. Phew. Crowley burned through online forms and confirmed moving details like a woman possessed. Or, more accurately, like she was racing against time. She managed about 10 minutes. Crowley was staring at a slowly loading page of yet another badly designed site asking to confirm details she had already entered twice, when she heard the low grizzling that haunted her waking and sleeping hours. She scrabbled desperately in the large side pocket of the diaper bag and triumphantly yanked out the emergency pacifier. She pushed back the carrier cover just in time for Warlock to expand his entire body with the force of his inhalation and start to scream. The people nearest her on the other computers actually winced at the volume. "Oh, sweetie, I know," she rambled, smiling down at his tiny scrunched face. "Here you go. You know your binky. You love your binky." Warlock took a hiccuping breath, and she popped the pacifier into his mouth with a practiced twist of her thumb. She smiled, even though his eyes were still shut, and enormous tears leaked down the sides of his face. "Isn't that better? Okay, just a few more minutes and— Oh!" Warlock yanked the pacifier out and flung it in an unexpectedly coordinated arc, and Crowley cringed as she watched it bounce and roll across the old carpet, gathering up fluff and lint and grime and approximately 50 separate diseases. Warlock coughed wetly, nose already snotty from crying, then cried louder. Crowley launched herself to reclaim the gross pacifier and stuffed it into her jeans pocket to be sanitized later, then scrambled back and started digging madly through her bags on her hands and knees. "Okay, do you want your stuffy?" Warlock flailed unhappily and kept screaming. The teething ring. Are you growing a tooth? Crazy early of you, but I wouldn't hold you back from your dental goals. Okay, no, not that either." Warlock wasn't interested in his rattle, his backup stuffed animal, a bottle, his plastic toy keyring, his backup stuffed animal, his rattle again, or even the grand treasure of Crowley's hair, which he was usually obsessed with grabbing and attempting to eat. The glares from the other library patrons were getting extremely hard to ignore, and Crowley was acutely aware of how much time was passing. She only had her computer reservation for so long before it would automatically log her out. Warlock was shrieking with his entire body, kicking and fists clenched, face getting distressingly dark red. The sheer volume was enough to physically hurt Crowley's ears. A sour-faced woman huffed audibly, "Oh!" and gave Crowley and Warlock a collective scowl, and abandoned her own computer terminal to stomp away towards the library service desk. Ah, shit. Warlock let out a shriek like he was being possessed by demons, shrill enough to make Crowley's teeth hurt. "Sweetie! Oh, honey, it's fine! It's fine! You're fine!" she attempted, although she could barely even hear herself, much less be a comforting sound to the hysterical baby writhing in his carrier. She felt the footsteps rather than heard them, and slowly lifted her head to stare up. The platonic ideal of a librarian stood there, his half-moon reading glasses glinting in the fluorescent lights, and a beleaguered expression crowned by a fluff of white curls. The sour woman sniffed as she walked past them all, back to her terminal to watch in anticipation. Crowley couldn't pay her any extra attention. She looked up over her sunglasses at the librarian and wondered if he would only kick them both out, or if he would also revoke her card or ban her from the library entirely. She wondered if the unfinished utilities address transfer would get flagged in the system, and their electricity would be cut today or tomorrow. Warlock's wails paused for a series of hiccups as he stared up at the new face, tears still welling up in seemingly infinite quantities. The librarian abruptly knelt beside the carrier. His voice was much softer than Crowley had expected, but perhaps that's because he wasn't speaking to her. "Hello, little one. You like my glasses, don't you? I think you do. A little different from your mamma's, aren't they?" Keeping his expression smiling down at Warlock, his tone changed to be a bit more adult. "Do you know what's wrong?" "No," Crowley mumbled miserably, feeling like more of a failure than usual. "I don't know what he wants. He's usually a pretty good sleeper." "May I?" Crowley made a helpless noise and shrugged. The librarian reached down and smoothly bundled Warlock into his arms. He immediately tugged off Warlock's socks and tucked his little feet under the lapel of his waistcoat, wrapped Warlock up against the left side of his chest, and began to slowly dance. He rocked in a steady rhythm, humming under his breath. Crowley inhaled roughly, still on her knees as she watched him, realizing she could hear again. Warlock sniffled and whimpered a little, tucked in a ball against the librarian's chest, but was otherwise quiet, big wet eyes staring like he was auditioning for a role as a Dickensian orphan. The librarian danced his way in a circle and back to face her, rocking evenly from foot to foot. "The vents in the library are set up rather poorly," he sang quietly, glancing between Crowley and Warlock. "The air near the floors tends to run rather cold when the fans are going. I suspect our sweet little man here was just chilly and upset about being woken up so uncomfortably. Weren't you? Yes, you were," he crooned at the baby. Crowley's shoulders dropped. She should have thought of that. She was a terrible caretaker. She glanced at the computer she had been using. Clear on the screen was a pop-up message. "Are you still there? System will log out due to inactivity in 2 minutes." Well, she had received her miracle. Might as well not waste it. "I will be so fast, I swear. I just need to get this submitted before the end of the business day, and our internet doesn't exist yet," she promised in a rush, plopping her fanny back into her chair and typing madly. "We're fine, aren't we, baby?" the librarian murmured. Crowley confirmed information and pressed buttons and entered passwords, glancing backwards every 30 seconds to make sure that Warlock hadn't been kidnapped or exploded. She blinked at the cheerful "Account information confirmed" window, for just long enough to feel her adrenaline levels dip below the usual amount typical for being pursued by bears. Less than 10 seconds later, the screen flickered to the default plain background with the bland end of session message as the computer automatically restarted. She let her head drop. She had made it. Holy shit! Crowley rotated around, suddenly feeling decades older than she was. She was so tired, all the time. The nameless librarian was swaying gently and smiling at her, a bit wryly. Warlock was sleeping like a rock in his arms, an undone bow tie in his sticky fist. The man was wearing sleeve garters, Crowley noticed abruptly. He was the platonic ideal of a librarian from the Victorian era. Worn waistcoat and pocket watch untire. And he was holding her baby. He had danced her baby to sleep. He had been well within his rights to evict them both. But instead he had given her time and space, and made sure that her baby was warm and happy. He worked to defend his literary kingdom against the hell that was customer service, and he still found it within his heart to be kind. Crowley was going to peel off those sleeve garters with her teeth. The librarian's face went slack, then colored up as pink as anything. Whoops! Crowley's expression was probably clear about her intention to eat him alive. Very uncool of her. He cleared his throat and wordlessly transferred Warlock back to her. He was warm and pink and solid, just as much as the soft arms that slid against hers during the exchange of the sleeping baby. He stepped backwards, bowed his head awkwardly, and strode in what might have been back to his usual work, or perhaps in an entirely random direction, in order to escape her predatory goals. Oh, so he was shy, too. How sweet. She tucked Warlock in, warm and snug in his carrier, and gathered up her various belongings for the trip back home, mulling over her options. Just because Crowley had a new priority in her life didn't mean that she didn't have needs and goals of her own. Unless he told her no, she was absolutely going to ride that soft-voiced tweed aficionado's cock into the sunset. Over the next few days, Crowley planned her approach carefully. Her long-term plans had a habit of boomeranging around to smack her in the face. But it was a whole new era and a whole new lifestyle, so nothing would go wrong this time. The first trip back to the library that weekend was less disastrous. Meaning not loud enough to rattle the windows. And she was as cute and primped as was, realistically possible these days. He wasn't there. Curses. The second visit had her wandering around the children's area, since she had a baby, and wasn't that what she was supposed to be doing now? What did tiny kids even like? Warlock had somewhat non-verbal methods of communication, but he was certainly sapient with his own little personality. Was she stunting him somehow by not encouraging his literary goals? How soon was too soon to start with the alphabet? Crowley thought that she caught a glimpse of a blonde head, but he vanished behind a bookcase, and she couldn't exactly sprint after him. Also, a tiny woman wearing every color in the visible spectrum, plus Warlock's body weight in jewelry, came up to tell her about all sorts of library programs for babies and moms. What the hell? Awesome! She wasn't much of a joiner, but again, what the hell? She could start working on Warlock's social circle. He would be a regular man about town by the time she had him potty trained. Work was work, and between Warlock's needs and the crushing weight of capitalism, Crowley barely was able to unpack beyond the essentials for weeks, much less pursue a tartan-wearing phantom of the tomes. She somewhat irregularly took Warlock to the various baby-themed library programs, but she literally never clapped eyes on the man. Eventually, she figured that he was a particularly vivid hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. Wouldn't be the weirdest thing she thought she'd seen in an altered state. A month after their inauspicious debut to their new town, she was hideous, and her hair was hideous, and her clothes were hideous, and Warlock was wailing like he was personally summoning Child Protective Services, because she was a failure in all ways, including mathematical, because she couldn't find her keys. She had just had them. She knew she had. Where were they? She mulled over the possibilities while she clumsily unloaded another bag of groceries into the back of the car. She must have unlocked it somehow. She knew. The door was open. Where were the keys? The empty carrier was crammed into the back seat. Warlock had decided that his carrier was the enemy on Wednesday, and so she had been holding him ever since. If she set him down, he screamed. No carrier, no crib, no bassinet, no blanket nest. It was her chest or nothing. So she had been living life one-armed for a while. If she ever had extra money again, she was going to make a donation to benefit amputees. Anonymously, of course, so no one got the wrong idea about her. One-handed, she managed to unload about half the cart before the spinning wheels began to turn, and the cart began to slowly trundle away into oblivion. Ah! She flailed for it, and then stopped with a choked whine. Oh! She couldn't leave her car without her keys, and she couldn't abandon her purse, and she couldn't run while carrying Warlock, and she couldn't just abandon her weekly groceries as they escaped to their new life of adventure. The cart rolled amiably down the slight slope and collided with someone. Of course it did. It was the phantom librarian who didn't exist. How kind of him to solidify enough to interact with the physical world. Naturally, she was wearing the ugliest clothing she owned, and Warlock was wearing both his oldest onesie as well as a dozen stains of dubious origin when she saw the hallucination man again. Even her imagination wouldn't give her any dignity, while she spiraled into probable psychosis brought on by several minutes of sleep over the last 2 days. Couldn't she at least be cute? Well, Warlock usually had the cuteness covered quite well, but it wasn't the same. Crowley blinked at him and made an incoherent noise while gesturing vaguely at the cart. Her hallucination smiled at her, the darling man that he was, and didn't even seem upset at the slow-moving homicide attempt she had inadvertently sent his way. He was dressed a bit softer than the last time he had manifested in the library, with a worn tan cardigan over his slacks. Warlock let out a delighted noise. Crowley mumbled some kind of thanks as he politely returned her cart. She looked between the rest of the groceries and the half-empty vehicle, and slowly began her work again.
"Would you like some help?"
her phantom asked, because of course he would, the sweetheart. She smiled at him as best she could. Her eyelids were so heavy. She nodded slowly and handed Warlock over. He squeaked along with Warlock's pleased grizzling. Since her hallucination was her, Warlock would surely be fine with his chest as well. Through some mathematical rule she couldn't remember the name of right now. Her phantom bounced on the balls of his feet and responded conversationally to Warlock's babbling, while she laboriously shifted the bags from cart to vehicle. It was so much easier with both arms, even if one of them was still sore from being almost constantly in use. She leaned against the car for a moment when she was done, utterly unable to even think about what happened next. She was so tired. Her hallucination cleared his throat politely, and she rolled her head over to face him. Oh, right. Maybe his phantomhood was expiring soon. Did he cease to exist when she wasn't paying attention? Probably. She summoned the strength of 1,000 suns and stumbled over to join him. She needed to get Warlock and find her keys and get home and cook and probably check her email. In retrospect, reaching over to brace against his warmth so as to safely reclaim her baby had a predictable result. She leaned against his comforting solidity and practically melted against him as something in her brainstem said safe. She was asleep in literal seconds.
"Help me! At grocery store on Main Street. Need advice. How much ambulance?"
"Are you hurt? Do I need to call 911 for you?"
"Not me. A lady handed me baby and fell asleep leaning me. Won't wake up. Is this narcolepsy? How tell? Sorry, misspell. One hand."
"Wait, please confirm if I have this right. A lady handed you her baby and is now sleeping in your arms as well?"
"Yes."
"Does she seem ill? Is the baby okay? Or is she just sleeping?"
Sleeping. Baby, okay. Baby now sleep. Both snoring. Heavy. Help me. Would do.
"Oh, this poor sleep-deprived family. Sit tight, Duck, I'm on my way. Do not call the expensive woo-woo siren wagon."
Heart emoji.
Crowley woke up slowly, feeling like her body was as heavy as cast iron, but comfortably so. She was just going to sink into this mattress until she fused with the Earth's core. That sounded nice. She had been having some really weird dreams, she recalled dimly. She had dreamed that a ghost had been asking her questions and then driving her car, and had been singing, maybe. Did ghosts sing? Must do. How else could they haunt all those old buildings with great acoustics? Be a shame otherwise. She lay there, warm and comfy, pondering if spectral hauntings were chosen based on how well the sound carried, or if it was more of a luck of the draw for new ghosts. She had been only half alive from sleep deprivation recently, so this was probably useful information to consider for her incipient demise. Crowley heard Warlock giggling and a strange voice cooing, and her eyes snapped open as her entire bloodstream was replaced with pure adrenaline. There was someone in her house. She sat up abruptly while trying not to make any noise, and blinked down at herself. She was still dressed in her day clothes, wrinkled and due for a wash, although her shoes had been placed neatly next to the bed, which she never bothered to do. Had someone tucked her in? There was a note on the side table, where she vaguely remembered there being a forest of used cups before.
Hello, dearie. Mr. Fell gave me a cheeky little ring to ask for my advice, and I came right over to help. He was convinced that you were having a narcoleptic episode, but I set him straight before he could call the ambulance. Babies are exhausting, you poor thing. You certainly needed the sleep, so once we got you bundled in bed, we unloaded the groceries. Your wee little man is such a darling. We warmed up your spare bottle in the fridge, but we're going to try to wake you up again at 5 to ask what kind of bottle he needs for dinner. If you're awake before then, we're in the main room, and we'll clear out as soon as you like. Tracy Potts, your library friend.
Crowley did remember Tracy, vaguely. She was just as colorful a character as her clothing choices had implied at their first meeting, and she coordinated a lot of the library programs where Crowley brought Warlock. Okay, maybe this wasn't a direct home invasion, but she had clearly missed steps 2 through 10, where she had been at the grocery store parking lot, and was now magically in her own bedroom. Okay, fuck it. Weirder things had happened. She heard Warlock give another bright little laugh, and she was staggering out of bed before she could think anything else. It was only okay if Warlock was okay. She reeled like a drunken sailor still adapting to land legs, but she managed to careen well enough into the living room and stared. Tracy Potts was sitting in a puddle of her own skirts, playing peekaboo with Warlock, who was losing his tiny mind with the way her bracelets jingled and sparkled. The carpet was clear, and the random items that had been colonizing the couch had been gathered together into the basket she had optimistically thought would be the baby toy home, back when she had had things like energy and the will to live. The dishwasher was running, she realized, at nearly the same time that Warlock laughed so hard that he began to cough, and instinct took over. Tracy saw her and beamed while Crowley scooped up her baby and patted his back to help. Tracy tucked a cloth over her shoulder just in time, and Crowley gave her a grateful look, still wordless with how mortifying this whole situation was. What did you say to someone who had seen you fail so badly at existence?
Oh.
The masculine voice came from behind her, and she turned while Warlock finished coughing and spitting up. Her library hallucination was standing at the entrance to the kitchen, shirt spattered damp and sleeves rolled up, blinking at her and giving her the sweetest and most awkward smile that had ever appeared on a human face. He twisted one of her dish towels between his hands before tucking them behind his back like he was awaiting assessment from a drill sergeant.
Hello.
Hey, she said, more or less to both adults in the room.
I have questions.
Of course you do, Doc,
Tracy soothed her. And damn it, Crowley was actually soothed. Warlock settled against her chest, warm and precious, and Crowley, for the first time in many months, was ushered to sit and relax while other people did the work. She blinked down at the unfamiliar nibbles and tea, while the hallucination, who might actually be an actual human, but the thought was too humiliating to look at directly, stammered about his own groceries and assurances that none of her food had been tampered with or eaten. She looked around while rubbing Warlock's back, and her throat got tight. The kitchen was clean. It had not been quite filthy before, but getting close. Now Warlock's scrubbed bottles were on their dedicated drying rack. The dishwasher was chugging along amiably, and the countertops and floors were shining. Tracy filled the air with amiable chatter that didn't require participation, and Crowley managed to drink a cup of tea that hadn't already gone cold for the first time in weeks. Her hallucination poured her another, his shirt sleeves still a bit wet on the edges. She looked at him and opened her mouth, intending to thank him or say something charming or witty.
Did I fall asleep against your chest standing up?
It hung in the air, and Crowley watched a delicate blush spread across his face in real time.
You did do that, yes. Oh, sorry. I thought you were a figment of my imagination,
she mumbled, and immediately wanted to punch herself in the face. This man had gotten her and her baby home safe, called for assistance, tucked her into bed for a nap, and cleaned her fucking house. And she had told him that he wasn't a real person. If she was any worse at this, she was going to start insulting both of their mothers. Tracy was giggling, and no help at all.
I apologize,
he tried after a moment.
If your initial impression of me was fictitious.
No, she rushed. And maybe it was because a 2-hour nap wasn't enough to make up for months of sleep deprivation. But she made a noise like someone flicking a door-stopper spring. When she eventually managed words, they weren't any better.
I just thought I had hallucinated you up in my hour of need or whatever. And since I never saw you again, I figured that you were the literal man of my dreams.
There was a pause, during which Crowley longed for the kind oblivion of death. Tracy let out a happy squeak, and the man on the other side of the table flushed entirely scarlet. Once Tracy got herself under control, she took over the conversation. Bless her, since apparently Crowley was only capable of pile-driving it beneath the Earth's crust. She encouraged Crowley to eat and finish her cup, and asked questions about Warlock, which was possibly the only topic that Crowley could handle. Weirdly, the weirdness of the whole situation made it easy to talk. She couldn't make it worse, after all. Yes, Warlock was growing like kudzu, and unexpected wasn't even half of the story of how Crowley was a maternal disaster. Turned out that her older sister was more enthusiastic about liaising with the chauffeur than her husband, the actual diplomatic liaison. After a discreet paternity test, their bouncing bundle of joy had been destined for an equally discreet adoption with some cover story. Crowley hadn't been able to handle it and had opened her big mouth to offer to take her nephew as her own. Her sister had been all too willing to sign over parental rights, sternly told her that there would be no contact for the foreseeable future in case of any questions. And within a very short time indeed, Crowley had gone from a stylish single professional to a stressed single parent. She loved her son so much. Warlock was perfect. She was still a disaster mom almost a year later, but she had been a disaster person before he had been part of her life, so they would make it work. Why the name? Well, it was cool. He was a cool kid. He should have a cool name. He would grow into it. Warlock flailed a bit and wiggled until she turned him around so he could grab at her plate. Her hands hovered over the options, but was interrupted with a gently cleared throat. His voice was gentle, and he was offering the plate in front of himself, slicing off a portion. Perhaps a piece of the banana muffin. He is 8 months old, you said? Crowley nodded and accepted the little chunk. Warlock gummed it over with his usual messy enthusiasm. He still liked to default to bottles when he was upset, but it was fading fast in favor of solid foods. The pediatrician had said not to worry as long as he was getting adequate nutrition. Thanks, Crowley mumbled under her breath, and she meant more than for the muffin and the babysitting. No one had ever been so kind to her, and having it come from near strangers was doing a number on her head. Tracy filled the silence again, wittering pleasantly, and before she knew it, Crowley was entering 2 sets of numbers into her phone. Aziraphale? She confirmed. Her hallucination, who had a name just as ephemeral as she had assumed he was, dipped his head with a wry expression of a man prepared to give an explanation for the 10th time. She waved Warlock's little hand at him. Cool name, twins. He smiled at her like the sun was rising, and she was reminded that, yes, he was, in fact, an exceedingly handsome man. How dare he be handsome in her direction when she wasn't prepared?
I imagine that you want your place to yourself soon,
Tracy interjected.
But before we head off, do you want us to entertain your little man while you shower? Not having to rush for once?
Crowley almost cried. She hesitated, then nodded. Oh God, she was abruptly hyper-aware of her own body. She was so gross. Aziraphale reached out, and Warlock lifted his own arms in preparation, and settled against his chest to be bounced comfortably. Crowley still couldn't wrap her head around it. I know this sounds like a line, but he really doesn't usually like new people. Then I am very lucky indeed, he answered cheerfully. Perhaps he can sense a kindred spirit. I also really like new people. Fortunately, I am the youngest of 8, so I have plenty of experience with caring for very young nieces and nephews. His voice changed to something a bit brighter, and he wiggled in his seat, dancing in place with Warlock. Yes, I do. I do. I am a very practiced uncle. Yes, I am. I am. You can tell, can't you? Okay, this was too cute to endure. Crowley was going to bite something. She fled to the safety of the shower before she embarrassed herself. Wet-haired, but feeling like a new woman, Crowley waved goodbye to both of them a few minutes later. The house was bright and clean, and suddenly felt very empty during dinner and the bedtime rituals. How odd! She had to bury her face in a sofa pillow like an adolescent when she checked her phone to see that Tracy had sent her an extremely knowing set of emojis and an offer. She texted back eventually, then sent another message to the other new number in her phone. Before she fell into her own bed again, there had been several messages back and forth, all culminating in more than she had dared to hope might be possible. Yes, and yes, and yes. It took a few days to find an evening that worked for everyone's schedule. Tracy and her niece, Anathema, were equally weird in the best way, and Crowley was able to get herself into some sort of order before Aziraphale arrived in his ugly but well-loved little car. She kissed Warlock goodbye in the arms of his babysitters before leaving on her first date in years with the angel of her dreams. Warlock was extremely proud of himself shortly after his 4th birthday, as he solemnly walked his mother down the aisle to marry the man who he had been calling Papa for as long as he could remember. The end. Thank you for reading. Please drop by the archive
and let the author know what you thought of their work.